I'd like to take a moment to share with you a solid conversation with a new client. It's my hope that what I shared with her is a help to you the way it was to her. She is 38 years old. She's a single woman, no kids, and a published model. She reached out to me and said, Doc, I've been following your content for about 2 months now. I'm very new to your content, and I'm hoping that maybe you can give me some insight on my dating life and why I'm having the challenges that I'm having. I thanked her for reaching out. I said, what are some of the challenges that you're having? She said, well, I've been seriously trying to date for at least the last 12 or 13 years. And all of the situations pretty much in the same. And I said, how was that? She said, well, pretty much guys not really fitting the bill, maybe looking good on paper, but not really being solid and well-rounded in all areas of life. And I'm starting to believe, after some conversations with my friends who are in similar boats, that perhaps I'm the problem here. I said, well, ma'am, that's a very honest assessment. You make my work a lot easier when you have such an honest perspective on your own journey. And I said, ma'am, that's part of the problem in this dating space. If people would really be honest, this is not to suggest that you can't meet a person and they turn out to be a total monster. But a lot of times when we see repeat patterns of failure in the dating space, we have to start by looking at ourselves. She said, Doc, I agree. And I couldn't agree more. She said, but I just need this really made plain for me as to maybe what mistakes I'm making. I said, well, describe to me, the guys that you typically date. She said, well, they're typically very nice looking men. She said, you've been a published model now for 10 years. And she said, I just tend to attract also very nice looking men. I said, beyond nice looking, what else are they? She said, well, a lot of them are very financially successful. Not all of them, but a lot of them have been very financially successful as well. Financially, they're solid. Physically, they're solid. But she said, other than that, it tends to not go further than that. And she said, the same is the case with all of my friends. I said, are they models too? She started laughing and said, a lot of them are. We kind of run in the same circles if you know anything about that space. I said, I don't know a lot about the space, but I can believe that. And to her point, very nice looking woman, very nice looking, very attractive physically, check the bill. I said, let me just ask a question and let's start from here. You say all of the relationships have pretty much ended because the men were not well-rounded. They, in other words, if I'm hearing you correctly, they either checked the financial or the physical box or both, but that was it, correct? She said, yeah. I said, do you know the difference between courting and dating? She said, courting? She said, there is no difference. They're the same. I said, I disagree. And you could talk to 50 different people about dating and courting, and you might get 50 different answers. That's fine. My point of giving you what I'm about to tell you is not to say that my way is the only way, but it's a good way. Courting is when you are dating with a plan and a purpose. So that makes sense. She said, so then what would dating be? I said, today, dating seems to be trying things that you might be interested in, but you need to learn more about. But you are doing it without a real plan or a purpose, without a real end goal. Anytime you're dating with an end goal, we go out of this space of dating and we go into this space of courting because we introduce a plan, we introduce a purpose, we introduce intentionality. I want to ask you a very serious question. How intentional have all of these dating experiences been for you? She started to tear up a little bit, and I was surprised. Very pleasant woman. It wasn't a hard conversation. And I asked her, I said, why are you getting upset? She said, if I'm being honest with you, they probably were all very surface and superficial. If I'm being frank, she said, it's probably one of those situations where most of the men were attracted to me, obviously, because of how I look. And she said, I think there's more to me than that. But, maybe I was attracted to them for the same, how they looked, how they were financially. I said, ma'am, that's, again, another very honest assessment. I said, but when we get into this dating space where we're only getting to know people that check some boxes and we're interested, but we're going to get to know them and just see what happens, then you're dating. That's not courting. And what tends to happen is we end up doing a number of things, including wasting time. I said, have you ever worked on any projects in your home? I said, do you own a home? She said, I do. I said, have you ever worked on any home improvement projects on your home? She said, I have. I said, you don't contract them out? She said, a few. She said, but I've done a few on my own too. I said, well, I have a friend who recently went to a hardware store. He's working on his deck and he's going to rebuild his deck and do some things. And so he wasn't quite sure when he was going to start, not quite sure about his materials, not quite sure about the type of wood he wants to use, not quite sure about the layout and the diagram or the measurement of his deck, none of those things. He just knew he wanted to upgrade his deck. And so he called me one day from the hardware store. He FaceTimed me. And I was like, dude, what are you doing? He said, Doc, man, I'm here trying to figure out what I'm going to do with this deck. I know you just recently had yours done. He started asking these questions. And so I was giving him answers. I said, how long you been in the store? What are you looking for? He said, man, I've been in here for about 45 minutes. I said, looking for what? He said, just looking at wood. I said, that's all you've been doing for 45 minutes? He said, yeah. Just looking at wood. He said, then I go over, I checked out some furniture, things like that. I said, you've spent 45 minutes looking at wood and furniture in a hardware store? He said, yeah. I said, what's the plan? Like, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm just trying to just walk through and just kind of browse. I see some things here and there that I like. And I'm just browsing through the store to get an idea of more of what I like. And I'll just kind of take it from there at some point. My client's listening to me. She looks kind of confused. I said, ma'am, he was lost in the hardware store because he didn't have a plan. He had an idea, but he didn't have a plan. She said, then what's the difference? I said, well, when I was getting my deck remade, first of all, I wasn't going to build my deck, so that's a big difference. But I knew exactly what I wanted. What I did is I went to the hardware store and picked out my wood. I knew the wood that I wanted before I got there, went right to it, picked out my furniture, picked out my railing, picked out these other materials that I wanted specifically for my deck, made a list. And then once I made the list, I contacted the contractor and said, this is what I want. Gave them the list of things. They gave me the quote. We went forward. She said, how long were you in the store? I said, I'm glad you asked. Took me 10 minutes. I went right to what I wanted because I knew what I wanted. And because I knew what I wanted, I didn't waste a lot of time in the store. I said, ma'am, today's modern dating looks like a wandering person in a hardware store who has an idea of what they like, idea of what they kind of want, but they don't have a plan. And when you date without a plan, you're going to look up and it's going to be years and you're still dating without a what? She said, a plan. I said, ma'am, you're an incredibly attractive woman. I said, I would highly recommend that you consider even those 5 areas of healing. I said, shameless plug, but let's just be honest. How did these men stack up mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, and financially? I said, if you just grade them and give each one of those items 20 points, how did they stack up? And I said, do it on average. How did they stack up on average mentally? How mentally stable were they? She said, out of 20 points? I said, yeah. She said, I maybe give them an 8, 7 or 8. I said, wow. I said, how about emotionally? What was their emotional maturity? How were they able to control and regulate their emotions? How calm did you feel in their presence? She said easily a 5 there. I dated a lot of immature guys. They looked nice, but they were very immature. They turned out to be very immature. A 5. I said, good. 8 and 5. All right. What about spiritually? She said, as in having like a spiritual foundation? I said, yeah. She said, maybe a 5. I said, good. 8, 5, and 5. I said, what about physically? She said, very nice looking guys. I give him maybe a 15. 8, 5, 5, and 15. I said, and what about financially? She said, maybe a 10. She said, some of them had money, and I would say maybe half of them were financially well and the other ones weren't. I said, perfect, a 10. 8, 5, 5, 15, and 10. Let's do the math. 8, 5, and 5 is what? She said, 18. I said, perfect. I said, then plus 15 is what? She said, 33. I said, perfect. Said, okay, and then plus 10 is what? She said, 43. I said, so that's 43 out of what? She said, 100. I said, ma'am, you went to college, didn't you? She said, I did. I said, 43 out of 100 is a what? She said, it's an F. I said, ma'am, let's not complicate this. You're a beautiful woman, but the reality is you chose people who did not fit the bill overall. They just fit a part of it. And your approach to dating was just wandering around with these men because they had parts of what you like, but you went into it without a plan. And because you didn't have a plan and you were not very clear on paper what it is that you wanted in all areas of life as related to your love life, you ended up wasting 45 minutes in hardware stores, not knowing what you really wanted, just having an idea of what you wanted. And here you are at the age of 38, still wanting a good relationship. I said, ma'am, the problem is you need to look at the rubric we just went through. And I would highly suggest you, instead of focusing so much on just finances and appearance, and those things are important, You need to look for men that check the first 3 boxes. She asked a great question. She said, Doc, are those men out here? I said, we absolutely are. I said, but ma'am, I'm going to be honest with you. As beautiful as you are, you don't check enough boxes for me because I've got a plan. And the reality is, while you check some physical boxes and some financial boxes, you clearly don't check enough mental, emotional, and spiritual boxes for me to even consider entertaining you other than for fun. She said, well, Doc, that was honest. I said, I'm being honest. That's why you hired me. And the reality is, when we look at dating that way, we won't have low standards with high expectations. The reality is you had very high expectations for your dating life over the last 10 to 12 years. But with these high expectations, you also need to have a high standard, because when you have low standards, it is delusional to have high expectations when you're dating with low standards. She said, Doc, it makes perfect sense. I can't disagree with you more. What should I do? I said, here's the easy thing to do. Instead of focusing on what they don't have, ask yourself the $1 million question. If I want to have high standards in men, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, and financially, let me ask myself a simple question. Am I checking the boxes mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, and financially? I said, because it's one thing to have a high standards for other people. It's another thing to have those same high standards for yourself. I said, ma'am, the reason why I can definitively say to you about you what I've said to you about being attractive but not checking all the boxes, because I have spent years making sure that I what? She said, check all the boxes. I said, so when we check our own boxes, then it's easy to have high standards, and it's even easier to have higher expectations. Beautiful woman, smart woman, but a very nice woman. And we're doing some work together. She's doing well. She's really focusing on those first 3 areas intently. And she made a decision that I totally agreed with. I asked her, I said, you probably need to take 6 to 9 months, maybe even a year off from dating. And she's done that. She's shut everything down. She's not going to entertain anyone for about a year. She's going to really pour into herself so that she becomes the standard that she looks for in others. I hope this story makes sense. If it did, type church in the comments with 3 R's. And then remember, you've got 2 jobs. 1, be better today than what you were yesterday. And 2, don't forget what I told you. What's up, everybody? This is Dr. Zeb. Listen, I've been dying to make this announcement for a very long time now, and I'm pleased to say that Inspire Nation has officially launched. Yes, we finally got a Facebook and YouTube community group where we're going to have exclusive content, exclusive shorts, exclusive discussion prompts, where we're going to engage with other people literally around the world who are on the same healing journey that we're on. I need you to go find these pages right now on Facebook and YouTube. Inspire Nation, follow the page, join the group, introduce yourself, and be prepared to link up with literally thousands of people around the world who are on the same healing journey, who are looking for the same resources, and who want to also be surrounded with other like-minded individuals who are growing in the same direction as you are. I'm so excited about this because it's the beginning of some great things I can't talk about right now. Listen, you got 2 jobs. 1, be better today than what you were yesterday. And 2, don't forget what I told you.